wisdom that's embedded in these stories is concerned. But this particular parable in Luke's gospel doesn't lend itself to quick and easy interpretation, even though Jesus does tell us right at the outset what it's all about. And that has to do with its challenge to our assumptions about justice, especially about human systems of justice. Reading this parable at a time when something as complicated and consequential as national foreign policy can now and is routinely crammed into the 280-character limit of an online tweet is akin to discovering a dark family secret. It stands to shatter our faith in things that were intended to give us a sense of safety and security. Don't get me wrong, for good or for ill, I still believe that there is great value in engaged citizenship. And where political discourse within our democracy is concerned, I would hope that we eventually recall that we are capable of and we deserve more substantive and thoughtful dispatches from our duly elected leaders and officials. Where this parable is concerned, however, we're talking not about human systems of governance administered by people of varying talents or sometimes no talent at all, but about order and justice as it is dispensed by the Creator, by a just God. And bear in mind as we consider this parable that this justice that is offered by God is offered within a world in which people often become cynical and jaded and preoccupied with self-preservation. Keep in mind. Not because there's something essentially stupid or spiritually lax within them, as tempting as it is to think that or even to say it out loud, and admittedly, yes, I even do that. But because the brokenness brought on by sin causes so much distress among the most open-hearted among us. People don't become cynical because they're bad people. I'm suggesting that what Jesus is trying to show us is that sometimes people become cynical because they are so open-hearted in a broken world that it drives them to become overly defensive. And there's also systemic pieces of that. As a straight white male, I have to admit that I'm privileged in ways that would allow me to not have to deal with those things, that would allow me to become defensive in ways that are socially acceptable. That's probably a topic for another sermon, but there are individual as well as systemic things at play in why people become what they are. This is a humbling realization for me, and one that I gained by reflecting on those times in my own history when I said and did things that anyone around me who was paying attention must have viewed as reactionary and self-serving. What does all that have to do with the care that we put into interpreting the parables? And how does it inform our understanding of this particular parable? Well, simply put, the parables are only meaningful in as far as they cause us to reconsider, to reevaluate our interactions with others, and to change those interactions in ways that line our words up and our actions up with the awareness, often neglected and forgotten, that we are God's image bearers. And that even those whom we consider to be our adversaries are, in fact, bearing the image of God within their souls, within their spirits. For some of us, that's a weight that is awkward to bear. Maybe that's because we think that we don't deserve to bear such a blessing, and maybe it's because we resent that blessing and consider it a burden. I don't want to be the image bearers of God. Taking this into consideration may be a key to Jesus' insistence in the Sermon on the Mount that we love our enemies and we do good to those who hate us. This is wisdom that is extremely difficult to live into. I'm sure you see this all the time. Especially when we have been deeply injured by the choosing to give in to cynicism and hopelessness. We are not to become slaves to cynicism and hopelessness. In a world that wants us to simply be grateful for what falls to us, whether it's just or not, Jesus reminds us to persist in faith until God's justice comes to fruition and God's peace is restored to creation. Things are not supposed to be as broken and corrupted and unjust as they are. But the resolution to the imbalances and the distortions of God's creation won't come through hatred. That restoration